Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Vidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinao Adhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarva Bhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Om. Good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to our many students attending these classes regularly online. We continue with our study of Shankara's wonderful Upadesha Sahasri. The next series of verses, there's a series of 3 verses in which Shankara describes Advaita Vedanta as a pramana. Pramana we know as a by the way, pramana, be careful of the Hindi meaning of pramana, which is an authority. Are your eyes an authority? Because in Vedanta, pramana doesn't mean authority, it means a means of knowledge. So your eyes are the means through which you gain knowledge of my presence here. So you can see why the Hindi meaning, you can see it's related, of course, but we can't use that meaning of authority in Advaita Vedanta. A pramana then is a means of knowledge. These next verses talk about it, and it's an extremely important topic in Advaita Vedanta. It's also one of the more technical topics, which is why we haven't discussed it here before. But this is our so-called I won't call it an advanced class. It's certainly not an introductory class. And this topic is necessary, I think, for us to continue our studies. So what I'd like to do, before we begin these 3 verses, I'd like to give you an overview of how Vedanta understands what is a pramana. This is, as I said, a technical topic. And in Western philosophy, they have this fancy name for it, epistemology. How's that? Epistemology in Western philosophy is the study of how we gain knowledge. And you can imagine, wouldn't that be an important topic? If what we're seeking in Advaita Vedanta is atma-vichara, atma-bodha, knowledge of atma, then how do we gain that knowledge? And how do we know that knowledge is valid? These are the 2 issues to be discussed. How? And then what is the validity of the knowledge gained? So we'll take a few minutes here, maybe more than a few minutes, and take an overview of this topic of pramanas. And I'll spend a while at the board in just a minute. Before I do it, it's maybe helpful to point out that among the different schools of thought in ancient India, like Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsaka, etc., there are different approaches. I won't say different approaches. Each school of thought acknowledges a different number of pramanas. Now, what are the pramanas? We'll see in just a moment. Vedanta seems to excel because it has 6 pramanas. Other schools of thought will accept 5 or 4 or 3. And when I put the 6 up on the board, it'll make a lot more sense. So let me go to the board and do that now. I should turn that off. That's good. Okay. So, pramana. Let me just make sure that I'm going to stay. Okay, I got the whole board. That's good. Pramana, a means of knowledge, instrument of knowledge. So please set aside your Hindi meaning of authority. And we're going to discuss 6 of them. By the way, you can see this ma in that. Not ma as mother, but ma as a Sanskrit root, meaning to measure. So pramana is a tool for measurement, so to speak. It is how we gain knowledge. Is that working okay? Okay. All right, so let us see the 6 pramanas in Advaita Vedanta. And some of them I'm going to touch upon very superficially. There will be 3 main ones. Let's see the 3 main ones first. First is, and I put Sanskrit words up only when they're important. These are important. Pratyaksha is perception. Perceptual knowledge. Perceptual knowledge. All right. So, right now, you see me. Your pramana for seeing me is your faculty of sight. Notice I didn't say eyes. You can have eyes, many people have eyes and can't see, right? So we can't just say eyes, we have to say faculty of sight. So pratyaksha, pramana, is your faculty of sight. Your power of hearing is also pratyaksha, pramana. Any of your 5 sense organs, senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, all of these come under the category of pratyaksha pramana. So our 5 senses, which give perceptual knowledge. So pratyaksha pramana is a means for perceptual knowledge. The next, we've discussed these 3 main ones. Anumana, there's our ma again to measure. And anu means after. This is our common word for inference. This is showing up, yes. Inference, the example given in our scriptures again and again. You see smoke above the mountain. Smoke is pratyaksha pramana. But then you infer the presence of fire on the mountain. Smoke is pratyaksha, fire is from anumana. So anumana pramana is our common word for inference. We use it extensively. Based on, in Sanskrit they call it, I'm not going to put words that you don't need, I'm not going to put up here. It's like hetu. Hetu is that which you base your, hetu is that which you perceive, upon which there is smoke. So you see that smoke. So based on the smoke, you infer fire, and that is inferential knowledge. I'm going to skip ahead to the last one, which is what we use all the time. Shabda pramana. Shabda literally means words, but not, so Shabda pramana is a pramana in the form of words, like the words I use, like the words used in our scripture. So outside of Vedanta, this would generally be called scriptural revelation. But we don't use the term scriptural revelation because we don't limit it in that way. When someone, in fact, the Hindi meaning comes a little close here of authority. The words of an enlightened person are pramana. That person has discovered the truth. That person is using words to lead you to the same truth that he or she has learned. So, therefore, Shabda, we won't limit it to scripture. It absolutely includes, in fact, the main part of Shabda Pramana is indeed scripture. Scriptural authority is a term often used for Shabda, but it's too limited. So we include something called pravachana. The words of a wise person would be included here. Now notice I've skipped 3. These 3 are included universally in all the the 6 traditional schools of thought in ancient India. The other 3 are sometimes included or sometimes subsumed. Subsumed, is that the right word? Sometimes included under anumana, and those are, and this is a little bit more, let us say, don't worry too much about these. Just before, so in fact, I'm gonna indent them because they're kind of related to anumana. So one is upamana. This is for completeness, we'll say. For completeness, we include upamana, which is comparison. The example given when someone who grows up in a village, seeing cows all the time, goes hiking up in the mountains and sees a non-domesticated cow, which looks quite different. Still knows it's a cow because he can compare it to the cow he saw in the village. So this is upamana, and you can see how it's like you can think of it as a subset of anumana, I think is safe. But Vedanta considers it an independent means of knowledge because it doesn't follow all the same rules as anumana. Next is, we use this in all the time, atma-vichara. We'll call it implication, although there's no exact word for it. When you observe something and it is inexplicable unless you make an assumption. That's technically a really good definition, but doesn't make any sense unless I give an example. You see someone who's really fat. I'm not that bad. And you observe that this person never eats all day long. You live with this person. You see them all day long. They never eat. How to explain this? They eat at night. That is artapati. It is inexplicable in any other way. You are inevitably led to assume that they must eat at night, and we can call this artapati. I've put implication up here as a translation, but there's no exact translation for this in English, so it's where there is no other way to explain something other than to make a particular assumption. We don't have one English word for that, so best to call it artapati. And the last of these 3 is, and again, these 3 are like in parentheses for completeness. Upalabdhi. Upalabdhi also means perception, but here, anupalabdhi, non-perception. This is a little unique to Advaita Vedanta. Most other schools don't accept it. How do you know that I do not have an elephant in my hand? First of all, do you know? Do you know that I do not have an elephant in my hand? You know. How do you know? Look at this is philosophy. This is what philosophers love. How do you know that I don't have an elephant in my hand? So in ancient India, they decided that the way in which you know I don't have an elephant in my hand doesn't exactly fit into this category of pratyaksha pramana. So they invent another one called anupalabdhi, which we'll call non-perception. So these are the 6 pramanas accepted in Vedanta. As I said, other schools of thought will accept the first 2 and the last one, and may or may not include these middle ones. Now, before I leave the board, one more feature we should discuss is that a pramana, a means of knowledge, there's another thing we'll talk about when we get to the appropriate verse, but right now, a pramana can give direct knowledge or indirect knowledge. Many of you have been attending our Uddhava Gita classes. This was the topic of the last couple of classes. Direct knowledge, which we call, let me give you the words. So direct knowledge, we use the word aparoksha, and indirect, we use the word paroksha. Those show up, yes. So we've discussed them extensively in that class, but let's discuss them briefly here. You have direct knowledge of me standing here. There's nothing mediating. Your sense of sight has direct access to me. So therefore, we would say that knowledge that comes from any of your 5 senses, we would call that, let me use the Sanskrit term here, we would call that aparoksha. Actually, there's a technical distinction. I'm erasing that because it violates a little technical issue in Advaita Vedanta. It is direct, it is unmediated. Can we get away with it? Let me call it aparoksha, but bear in mind that we use here's why we shouldn't call it aparoksha. There is a mediation between consciousness and the object, right? That mediation, the factors that mediate that knowledge is your eyes, optic nerve, brain, mind, all of that. So for that reason, let me confine my discussion of direct and indirect knowledge. This is a way to be more clear. I'm going to confine that discussion only to Shabda Pramana. It's a very complicated topic if we try to apply that to these. As I just demonstrated, you see me directly in front of me, but how direct is it really? Little complicated. So let's set that aside and apply these 2 only to Shabda Pramana. Does Shabda Mana give direct, immediate knowledge, unmediated knowledge, or does it give indirect knowledge? And the answer is, it depends. Depends on the subject matter. For example, the Karma Kanda talks about doing rituals to accumulate punya karma. Have you ever seen punya karma? How do you know there is such a thing as punya karma? And how do you know that this particular ritual produces that punya karma? There's no way to know it directly, nor is there any way to really prove it or verify it. You know, one could say, well, you verify it when you get to heaven. Well, what good is that now? So if you have to wait, this is a problem I've mentioned before. This is a problem with most religions. They promise you something that happens after you're dead, and they have no way of establishing the validity of that. Well, when the Karma Kanda of the Vedas speaks of doing rituals which have certain results, those results are definitely not part of direct knowledge. So let's say that words, when the words of the scripture or when the words of an enlightened person, when those words reveal things which are, let's say, unverifiable. So heaven and hell, punya and papa, so much. And the particular rituals. Why in this ritual do you offer ghee, and why in the other ritual do you offer some other samagri? There are all these rules. How do we know these rules are correct? How can we verify their correctness? We can't. So for that category, the Shabda Pramana, the scriptural revelation we find, especially in the Karma Kanda of the Veda, is unverifiable, so we call that paroksha jnanam. The knowledge given by the Karma Kanda of the Veda is called paroksha jnanam, jnanam meaning knowledge, of course. So the Veda gives paroksha jnanam with regard to these unverifiable realities like heaven and hell, etc. Of course, that's not why we meet here on Sunday mornings. We're here to discuss Advaita Vedanta, whose subject matter is not heaven and hell and all these unverifiables. So Advaita Vedanta helps you discover your true nature, the nature of Atma. So let's consider that when the words reveal not these heaven and hell, but when these words reveal Atma, your true nature, is that knowledge direct knowledge or indirect knowledge? Vedanta's teachings giving you knowledge of Atma, is that knowledge you get direct or indirect? Once again, it depends. Because, in fact, I meant this was in yesterday's Uddhava Gita class. I said, we all start off with indirect knowledge. The first time you heard Vedanta or Vedanta book or a Vedanta teacher, the first time you heard your true nature is consciousness, sat-chit-ananda atma. Did you instantly become enlightened at that moment? And the first time you understood what tat tvam asi means, which is the ultimate teaching of Advaita Vedanta. Just reading those three words makes you enlightened? No, not at all. So the point I'm making here, an extremely important point, is that at the beginning, the words of Vedanta give you indirect knowledge of Atma initially, because there's a problem. And the problem, we're going to discuss the problem in our text, so I'm not going to elaborate on it right now, but there are certain impediments. Let me make this important observation first, and then it'll make more sense. The words of the scripture, when they reveal things like punya and papa, heaven and hell, rituals, etc., they can only give indirect knowledge. It's not possible to gain direct knowledge of that. But the words of the scripture are capable, and the words of an enlightened person are indeed capable of giving direct knowledge in one and only one situation, where that which you're gaining knowledge of is not remote. So heaven and hell, remote. Punya and papa, remote. The nature of these rituals, remote means outside, away from us. But what about when the object of knowledge is not remote? And the classical example of this is found in the Mahabharata. Many of you, if not most of you, you know that Karna was the eldest son of Kunti. But when he was an infant, he was given away, so to speak. I did a long, complicated story. We'll skip on that. So Karna was raised by some others. And then, much later, decades later, Karna meets his birth mother, Kunti. And Kunti tells Karna, "You are my son." Now that's an interesting group of words. They are words. Kunti here is the authority. She's the mother, after all. So she's an authority on whether or not Karna is really her son. But here's the point. When Karna is told by Kunti, "You are my son," is that knowledge indirect? Like knowledge of how what a ritual accomplishes? Karna says, "Oh, I am your son." That's direct knowledge. I am your son. The object of knowledge is not remote. And that's a pretty rare situation, but for us it's an extremely important situation. When the object of knowledge is not remote, the scripture and an enlightened person can indeed give aparoksha knowledge of Atma. So it depends. And we're going to find out what it depends on. When the words of the scripture, when they give indirect knowledge of Atma or direct knowledge of Atma, there are impediments which we're going to talk about. What are the impediments which prevent that? By the way, the other point I made in the other day's class about indirect knowledge of Atma is useless. It's not enlightenment. Think of all the great scholars, especially in Varanasi, Benares, the seat of Vedantic learning in India. There are so many great scholars who know so much, including all of this is nothing for them. They learned this decades ago, so they know what the scripture teaches about Atma, about Tattvamasi, the relationship between Atma and Brahman. Are those professors enlightened? I joked the other day, if you want to find out if your professor is enlightened, there are several tests. One is, can you imagine an Indian professor teaching in coming to America for the first time to teach? And one kid's got his feet propped up on a chair, another has a can of Coke on there, and how do you think that Indian-born professor coming to the US for the first time, how would they react to the casual behavior of American university students? You can get my point. However, if that professor was really enlightened, he'd say, "Yeah, enjoy your Coke." Not going to happen. Anyway, so the point is that gaining academic knowledge, of course, is indirect knowledge. Okay, that's a fairly lengthy introduction. Oh, I neglected to tell you, I was going to make a point beforehand to show you how and why this is so important. It would have been better if I did that before I put all this boring stuff on the board. That was my intention, but I kind of forgot it. So let me just tell you an anecdote to show you why this is not mere technical blabber. How's that? This isn't technical blabber. This is crucial information about how Vedanta works. And the anecdote, a few of you have heard this before, about my own guru, Pujya Swami Dayananda, who was trained in a tradition which more or less follows some of the teachings that are called Neo-Vedanta. And one of the traits of Neo-Vedanta means not following Shankara very closely. And one of the traits of one of the features of that Neo-Vedanta tradition is to consider Advaita Vedanta to be a theory, and then through some kind of sadhana, through some kind of spiritual practice, one gains direct knowledge. That is to say that Vedanta can only impart theoretical knowledge, indirect knowledge. Vedanta can only impart indirect knowledge, and that you require some kind of meditation. Usually it's a meditation practice. Through meditation, this is a typical presentation in Neo-Vedanta. Vedanta imparts only theoretical, indirect, paroksha jnanam, and then through meditation, that indirect knowledge gets converted somehow into direct knowledge. And what happened to Pujya Swamiji is, as a young man, he dedicated his life to these studies. And after more than a decade, he had fully understood all the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, and he had been engaged in intense meditation for years. And he was wondering, now what? He didn't find what he was looking for. Something was missing. He became so frustrated at that point. He tells the story that he had a library of Vedanta books. He gave them all away. He was ready to walk away from Advaita Vedanta because he concluded this as, I got the theory, I've been meditating, doing this practice, I'm still not enlightened, so it doesn't work. He was on the verge of making that conclusion and walking away. His teacher, Swami Chinmayananda, advised him to go out and listen to one or two other teachers. I'll shorten the story here. So he went to Andhra Pradesh and studied for some time with one Swami Pranavananda was his name. And what did Pranavananda say? Vedanta is a pramana that is capable of giving direct knowledge, aproksha jnanam. Pujya Swamiji had never heard that at the time. In fact, it's not taught by this tradition that we call Neo-Vedanta. It's taught by Shankara very vividly, very clearly, but it's not taught by those who don't follow Shankara very carefully. And for Pujya Swamiji, he called it the missing key to know that Vedanta was an independent means of gaining direct knowledge. Like your eyes can be considered an independent means of gaining direct knowledge of my presence here in a chair, in the same way Vedanta is an independent means of gaining direct knowledge of your true nature as sat-chit-ananda atma, therefore negating this theory practice approach, which hung him up, so to speak. So he took this key, this idea that Vedanta is a pramana capable of giving aproksha jnanam, and he, with that key, he said, he restudied the scriptures and discovered there was no problem. There was no problem. No problem in a scripture, and no problem here. That was it for him. He needed that key. And perhaps that's why we're spending some time on this particular topic. It's a topic that was extremely important to Pujya Swamiji. It's a topic that's not just important to him, but important to everyone who assumes this theory practice approach. So that approach, assuming that is the correct approach, is a huge obstacle. Why is it a huge obstacle? First of all, you consider all this to be theory. There is all this stuff. you don't take it so seriously if it's just theory. And then you put the emphasis on meditation. And with your partial knowledge of the theory, you go on meditating and nothing happens. Huge problem. So I hope you can appreciate the importance of this topic. Maybe not the importance of the pramanas we kind of skipped over, but the importance of understanding Advaita Vedanta as a independent means of knowledge which can impart aproksha jnanam, direct knowledge. So with that introduction, we can now see our current set of verses. Whew. We'll see about the time. I think we're okay. All right. So let's pick up the thread. Vidya vidye shuti prokte, vidya vidye shuti prokte, ekatvanya dhiyau hinaha, ekatvanya dhiyau hinaha, tasmat sarva prayatnena, tasmat sarva prayatnena, shastre vidya vidhiyate, shastre vidya vidhiyate. Vidya and avidya. Vidya, knowledge of sat-chit-ananda, Atma. Avidya, ignorance about sat-chit-ananda, Atma. Shruti prokte, they are both taught in the scriptures. In particular, in the Upanishads, that portion of the Vedas that contains these particular teachings. And these two, we got these grammatically dual structures here. Vidya and avidya. Avidya, ekatva, nahi naha. We have to break apart. Vidya is connected to ekatva, oneness. Vidya, hi naha, indeed, for us, for all of us, the scriptural teachings called vidya lead us to ekatva, oneness, discovering that your consciousness is not yours, it is a reality because of which everything exists. And contrarily, avidya, ignorance, leads not to ekatva, but anyadhi. Anyadhi, dhi means buddhi, anya, difference. So a conclusion about separateness. I am me, you are you, he is he, she is she. We are all independent, separate beings. And this is the commentator makes a very important point here. So the scripture then, since knowledge the scripture, so the scripture is not only talking about knowledge and ignorance. In order to discuss that, you have to talk about ekatva and anyadhi. You have to talk about not, let me try to make this clear. The scripture necessarily has to talk about not only ekatva, oneness, it has to talk about multiplicity, bheda, difference, as well. Suppose scripture only talked about ekatva, and you come to class, and Swami Tadatmananda says, everything is one. One sat-chit-ananda Atma, one satyam jnanam anantam brahma. There is only one sab eka hi hai. Everything is but one. And ek, I have to get my Hindi right here. So if I keep speaking like that, you'll get very quickly bored and not come back for the next class, in spite of the fact that everything I'm saying is real and true and based on scriptures. That's not how Vedanta works. Vedanta must necessarily address us in our current state of ignorance, which means Vedanta has to discuss our worldly experiences, which occur at the level of duality. So any teaching, and this is a problem of, I mentioned before Neo-Vedanta, there's another Neo. Don't think about Matrix. Not that Neo. This Neo is Neo-Advaita, which somewhat resembles what I just said. Everything is one, 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 one. Everything is one. If you think there are many, you're wrong. Forget it. Just stop thinking about many and turn your attention to the one. That is an example, not a very good example, of Neo-Advaita. It doesn't work because it doesn't address us in our current state of ignorance. Vedanta does. So, Vedanta is a pramana for ekatva. Now here's a little, you would never get this technical point if I didn't give you this introduction. Vedanta is a pramana for ekatva, for your true nature as sat-chit-ananda atma, which is one. Is Vedanta a pramana for duality? Not ekatva, but bahutva, manyness. Here, anyadi, manyness. So there are many atoms in the world. There are many individual people. There are many things, rocks and trees. Is Vedanta a pramana for all of that worldly duality? No. It refers to it. It must refer to it because it's a common experience in the state of ignorance. But it is a pramana. It's like, let me try to find an example. Suppose you're reading a book on history, and that book, actually that won't work. Let me not give you a lame example. The purpose of Advaita, every pramana has a purpose. Here we go. Every pramana has a specific object of knowledge. Your eyes are suitable only for seeing. Can you hear anything with your eyes? Can you see anything with your ears? You get my point. Each one of your 5 senses is targeted, has a specific object of knowledge. So too, Advaita Vedanta has a specific object of knowledge. That object is Sat-chit-ananda Atma. And as I just said, many other things are included in teachings of Vedanta necessarily to address us in our current state of ignorance. Otherwise, Advaita Vedanta would be reduced to this Neo-Advaita, everything is Brahman, everything is Atma, there's only consciousness. You only think, this is one of their famous statements, you only think you're not enlightened. Stop thinking like that. Honestly. That is a fair representation of Neo-Advaita. How helpful is that? Look at it. They start off with a correct statement. You think you are unenlightened. And Advaita Vedanta agrees with that completely. That is, due to ignorance, you think you're unenlightened. But they do not remove your ignorance, they meaning the teachers of Neo-Advaita. They don't try to remove your ignorance. All they do is, if you're thinking that you are unenlightened, stop thinking like that. And, the bad American joke where the guy goes to the doctor. Guy says, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this." Doctor says, "Well, don't do it." without addressing the problem. You get the point. So the doctor didn't diagnose and treat the problem, and in the same way, Neo-Advaita doesn't diagnose and address the problem. They just say, stop thinking like that. Okay, enough said. Tasmat, therefore, sarva prayatnena, with all effort, shastre, in our scriptures, specifically in the jnana kanda of the Veda, the Upanishads, vidya vidyate. The teachings of Advaita Vedanta are imparted. So, sarva prayatnena, with all effort, means that the focus of Advaita Vedanta is again, what is the object of knowledge? In the Karma Kanda, the object of knowledge is rituals, prayers, punya papa. Not so in the Jnana Kanda. The Upanishads, the object of knowledge is sat-chit-ananda Atma, which is identical to Brahman, and for that object of knowledge and that object of knowledge alone, Advaita Vedanta, those Upanishads are a pramana. There's a side topic I'd like to, this is a little important. This is the right time to bring it up. Advaita Vedanta makes many references to teachings of Advaita Vedanta, many references to things like the doctrine of karma, to how about 5 elements? Let's take this. This really bugged me when I first came I was probably about 30 years old, young Vedanta student, and it bugged me. Why do they only talk about 5 elements? This is so non-scientific. And one of those 5 elements is space. Treating space as an element called ether was disproved 150 years ago by, I think, Maxwell or one of those great scientists, disproved this theory of ether, that there was a thing called space. So how does Vedanta, how my objection as a young man was, how can this brilliant teaching, how can it accept something as lame as a doctrine of 5 elements? That bugged me a lot. And if that were not resolved, I wouldn't be sitting here today. Because I continue, as you all know, you've listened to me a lot, you know my orientation. For me, science must be accepted. Science is an excellent description of the world that we experience. We have no better description of the world in which we live. And further, science is always advancing and giving us better and better descriptions of the world in which we live. It's not dogmatic. It doesn't cling to something that it taught years ago. So I have great respect for science. So think of this 30-year-old young man listening to Puja Swami Dayananda teaching this, Atma sat-chit-ananda Atma. I said, yeah, wonderful. I'm getting it. And then the world consists of 5 elements, including space. What is this? That bugged me so much. And it was easily resolved by Puja Swamiji using this teaching about the 6 pramanas. He made it very clear that by the way, let me go back to that chart a little bit. And I thought we would go on a little further in the text, but I think it's better that we discuss this topic instead. Let me return here to our list. Science is a means of knowledge for gaining knowledge about the world. Which pramanas are used by science? Well, science begins with observation. Absolutely. You all know, you've learned something about the scientific method, right? Begins with observation. You observe something. Science begins with observation. But then there's a lot of math and physics and everything else, chemistry, that you extend on your observation. Like you see the smoke, and you extend that observation to knowledge of the fire. You observe something under the microscope or telescope or some kind of scope. Interesting, I use that kind of expression. Puja Swamiji would do that all the time. I just have this fond memory of him today for some reason. Anyway, some kind of scope, that's his kind of joke. So, using some kind of scientific instrument, you extend your observation into a conclusion. And then you write your PhD thesis, which is published. And that book becomes an authoritative source of knowledge, which gives you only paroksha jnanam, knowledge about the world. So this is science. It fits into this structure very well. We're going to skip these three, of course. When Advaita Vedanta says there are 5 elements, one of which is space. First of all, you can't even see space. How about Earth? You can see Earth. But you see it with your eyes, you can smell it, you can feel it. Our knowledge of elements is pratyaksha, except for space. We'll say space would be anumana, perhaps artapati, but we won't go there. So we can extend our observation and infer the existence of space. Fine. But science has demonstrated there are not 4 plus 1 elements. There are, I think, 104 natural elements, naturally occurring elements, and then another couple of dozen or more that are created in laboratories. More than 100 elements, which have been observed. You can see it, you can feel it, touch it, taste it, I suppose. Some of those elements are probably poisonous, you may not want to. Point is that science gives us valid knowledge of the world in which we live, and now we have science contradicting. Let me turn it around. We have Advaita Vedanta contradicting what science says. How do we resolve that? It's like suppose your eyes and ears gave contradictory information. A good example, have you ever watched a video on YouTube where the person is talking and the lips move later? You know that. So what you see and what you hear contradict. And you know there's something defective because they contradict. So here we have a contradiction. Vedanta says there are 5 elements. Science says there are 100 plus. We have a contradiction. In order to know that Advaita Vedanta is valid, we have to resolve that contradiction. How is that contradiction resolved? What is the object of knowledge for which Advaita Vedanta is a pramana? So, pratyaksha, the object of knowledge, are things that you can perceive, obviously. The object of anumana pramana are things that you can infer, right? Like the fire. The object of the karma kanda of the Veda are rituals. and punya papa, etc. That is the object of knowledge for the karma kanda. What is the object of knowledge for the jnana kanda of the Veda? Sat-chit-ananda Atma Brahman alone. Meaning that we readily admit that the Upanishads and the entire body of teachings on Advaita Vedanta is not a pramana for anything other than Atma, which is Brahman. With that in mind, when Vedantic scriptures, come back here. When the Upanishads and other Vedanta teachers refer to things like elements, which supersedes, science or Vedanta? This is so important. And notice that I don't think I have to answer that question, right? I set it out as a rhetorical question. Vedanta is not authoritative when it describes the world in which we live. Vedanta is not an authority in which, when it quotes that there are 5 elements, what it is merely doing is stating the commonly held world view at that ancient time and place. They happened to think there were 5 elements back then. If the rishi lived today, they would say there's 100 elements. If the rishi lived 1,000 years in the future, they would say everything is whatever it is, whatever quarks are made of. Don't ask me what, we don't know what quarks are made of. So rishis living in the future would say something that contradicts modern science. So here's the point. One Sanskrit term I didn't introduce here. In this anuvada restatement, when the Upanishads refer to worldly realities, it is not pramana, it is anuvada, a restatement of conventional thinking at that time and place. Now, that applies throughout. That applies to all subject matters other than Atma and Brahman. Watch this. Is Advaita Vedanta a pramana that establishes the validity of the doctrine of karma? Absolutely not. Doctrine of karma is anuvada. It is a restatement of the commonly held worldview at that time and place. This is so important. Does it mean the doctrine of karma is useless? That's not what we're talking about. It's incredibly valuable and reasonable, and it's a whole different topic that we're not going to get into here at the end of our class. But the point I'm making is that the subject matter determines whether or not the Upanishads are authoritative or not. The teachings of the ancient rishis, I'll conclude here, the teachings of the ancient rishis are a pramana only for Atma, which is Brahman. Any other subject matter we must consider to be anuvada, a restatement of the worldview, the commentator. All of this is based on a commentator who says everything else. The term he uses is loka prasiddha. It is well known in the world. If you lived 3,000 years ago in India, the doctrine of karma would be well known to you. The fact that there are only 5 elements would be well known to you. This was the conventional worldview at the time. When Vedanta refers to it, it is anuvada, a restatement of an ancient worldview. Vedanta is not a pramana for those subject matters. Okay, we'll continue this topic in our next class. Oh, let me, just before we conclude with the prayer, let me mention we will not be meeting next week. My Guru's ashram has a anniversary celebration, and I'm required to be there, so I won't. Next week we'll skip and then continue the following week. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.